Hey there, Simon here from AQ Outdoors, just checking in with a quick video on how to choose a whitewater kayaking paddle. In this video, we're just going to discuss a few considerations and characteristics you might want to consider when buying a whitewater kayaking paddle. So the first thing we're going to discuss is your paddling style. Second will be the size of the paddle blade. Third is going to be the shaft design and length. And lastly, we'll discuss the paddle materials, both the blade and the shaft. First up is paddling style. And the way we address that on the water and in the store is very simple. We'll ask a question. Are you looking to paddle freestyle? Are you looking to river run or creek? Or are you looking for a paddle that is going to do a little bit of everything? If someone answers they're primarily going to be freestyle paddling, we're going to lead them towards a blade that tends to be cut away a little bit on the bottom and the volume is more on the top of the blade. Because with a lot of freestyle moves, they're quite dynamic and there's the risk of hitting the blade on the edge of the boat, which ultimately causes damage to the blade. If someone's looking for something that's more of a river running or creeking style paddle, then we're going to look at something that has a bit more volume on the bottom of the blade and maybe a little bit less on the top. That's because it's a bit more versatile in shallow water conditions, and it also allows us to have a nice vertical stroke and gives us the best opportunity to generate a lot of power, whether that's through a boof or just a simple move in whitewater. It's important to take this all under the context and the lens of it does depend on your personal experience level and your budget, and we'll talk about that a little further as we go along in the video. Just to round this out, most people come in and they're looking for something that's an all-round paddle. And so in that regards, we tend to lean towards more of the river running blade style rather than the freestyle blade because it is a little bit more versatile. So we've covered paddling style, now we're going to move into the ever important blade size conversation. There's a lot of things to consider here, but we're going to try and keep it fairly simple. So typically we have two blade sizes, we just call them small and large. If you are a newer paddler or a paddler of smaller stature, we will tend to guide you towards a smaller paddle blade. There's less resistance on the blade when you're paddling. It allows you to have a good, steady or faster cadence of stroke, and it will provide less fatigue essentially over the course of a day of boating. If you're a large or well-conditioned paddler or very, very experienced, we're likely going to guide you towards a larger paddle blade because that's going to give you a lot more power in each paddle stroke, and because you're larger or stronger, you're still going to be able to keep that paddle cadence relatively high because that resistance is not such a big deal. Now we're going to move on to shaft design and length. First up, we're going to talk about the shaft design. Paddles come in straight shaft and bent shaft. Straight shaft is exactly what it sounds like. It's a straight shaft paddle, just straight with two blades plonked on the end. Bent shaft paddles will have a bend in the shaft. They're very different from manufacturer to manufacturer, but they all have the same outcome in mind, which is essentially providing a shaft that aligns with the bend in your wrist, and therefore it causes less fatigue and joint pain than a straight shaft paddle does. So this really comes down to personal preference. If budget is a concern, straight shaft all the way. If you have joint issues or you're going to be paddling a lot, then it might be worth considering the extra expense to get a bent shaft paddle. One other thing to consider in the shaft design is that you can get one-piece paddles, you can get two-piece paddles, and you can get four-piece paddles. So if you want something that's easy to travel with, a two-piece paddle gives you the best flexibility to strength ratio. If you want something to be a spare paddle in the back of your boat, a four-piece paddle is going to be much easier because many of the modern boats won't fit a two-piece paddle in the back. Another thing to consider in the shaft design is whether you need a small shaft or a regular diameter paddle. Some of the manufacturers offer a small diameter shaft for paddles with smaller hands. This essentially reduces fatigue and increases paddling performance for those with smaller hands. Now we're going to move on to length. Length is very much attached to a couple of key things. One is paddling style. If you're paddling freestyle, you're likely going to go for a shorter paddle because you don't want a huge long lever in your hands where you potentially injure your shoulders, and you really don't need it. If you're river running and creeking primarily, you're likely going to go for a slightly longer paddle because you want a little bit more reach on those boof strokes, and you do want a little bit more power out of each of the strokes when you're maneuvering around in challenging whitewater. The other thing to consider with shaft length is going to be how tall you are. Now this is a bit nuanced. I, for example, have a very narrow grip on my paddle, so the old technique of putting the paddle on your head and having a 90-degree bend doesn't really work for me, but it's a very good reference point. So basically you take the paddle, you put the middle of it on the top of your head, and then you have 90-degree bends in your arms, and then you should have 4 to 6 inches between your hands and the paddle blade, and that's going to be a good length shaft for you as a general all-round paddle. One final thing to consider, some whitewater paddle manufacturers offer models with adjustable length ferrules in the middle. So the paddle I use, I can adjust up to 10 centimeters. So if I'm play boating, I shrink it down to 194. And if I'm creek boating, I can extend it out to 201 or thereabouts. And that's a really nice feature if you're using one paddle for multiple applications. So now, last but not least, we're going to look at paddle materials. So if we just list them, we're going to look at a basic nylon fiberglass blade with a fiberglass shaft, then moving into a laminate fiberglass paddle, which is a cloth and resin, very stiff, very strong. Then we move into a full carbon paddle, which is a very stiff, strong laminate option. And then you have foam core carbon paddles as well. They're essentially cloth and resin with foam on the inside of the blade and then a Dynel edging on the outside, which is what bowling balls are made out of. And this is to prevent the paddle shrinking over time. So first up, for the budget conscious paddler, the nylon fiberglass infused blades with a simple fiberglass shaft is going to be your best option. They're relatively lightweight, the blades are very strong, and they virtually never shrink because of the nature of them. They're going to be heavier than the other models, and you are a little bit limited because typically they only come in a straight shaft. If you move into the laminate fiberglass blades, you're now getting something that's a lot stiffer and a lot lighter. It will over time wear down, however, because of the nature of the material it's built out of. These are available with fiberglass or carbon shafts, depending on the manufacturer, and you can typically get them in straight or bent shaft. If you move into a full carbon laminate paddle, this is a level up in stiffness and a drop in weight versus a fiberglass laminate paddle. Very, very similar overall, but you will have a slightly stiffer paddle, which means less power loss, but they will also chip away and shrink just like a fiberglass paddle will over time. These will also come typically with a carbon shaft and in straight or bent shaft layout. If you go to the top of the pile, you have a foam core carbon paddle. So as I mentioned, they have foam inside the blade with carbon laminate around the outside and a Dynel edging to protect them and provide longevity. A foam core carbon paddle is going to provide the highest performance of all of the types we've mentioned. You'll find less flutter. The blades float out of the water really nicely at the end of the stroke. They grab the water really nicely, and when you're rolling, it actually helps the blade float to the surface. One of the downsides with them is they do have the ability to delaminate away from the Dynel. It's not common, but it does happen. And because they're hollow, they're not really hollow, but they have foam in them on the inside, you can actually puncture through the laminate carbon and put a hole in the paddle. That's not going to happen with any of the other models. One little addition at the end that I would like to put in, there's obviously a big price range here, anywhere from $150 all the way through to $900 to $1,000. What we tell people here is if you paddle with a $150 paddle and you've not experienced an $800 paddle, you're gonna love that $150 paddle, almost certainly. But as soon as you paddle with a $400 or $500 paddle, you're gonna start questioning why you bought the $150 paddle. So what I would suggest is figure out what your budget is, try something within that budget, figure out what works best for you, stay in that lane until you're ready to upgrade, because they all work really well. There are just some benefits obviously in the more expensive models. In summary, there's a paddle for everyone. It's worth doing a little bit of research and understanding what your budget is and really what you want the paddle to do to make sure you get the right paddle. Thanks so much for checking out the video. If you have any insights, questions, or comments, please put them in the comments section below. If you liked the video, hit subscribe, and to learn more about us and the paddles we sell, check us out at aqoutdoors.com.